All right. Chris took a few of my jokes, but that's okay. And it's okay to also to abbreviate the introduction a little bit, because when my mother originally wrote it, it was much, much longer than that. So we're going to cover a lot of ground in a short period of time. I guarantee you're going to have time to ask questions. Anything is fair game. So we'll be able to do that ideally within the first hour or so. But I'll be here for the panel as well. So rest assured, if you do have questions at any point, I'm happy to answer them. So we'll run through my presentation, which is really going to focus on the science. So again, a lot of what we've heard about marijuana in the last few years, and you've heard a lot about it, I'm going to break it to you. A lot of what you've heard is either incomplete or just flat out untrue. And part of the reason for that is because when you think about who you hear about marijuana from, at least in the public view, you hear about it from people who have political agendas. And so what they want to do is they want to get you to vote for it or against it, and unfortunately they're going to twist the data to try to fit their agenda, to try to fit their narrative. And we're going to point out several ways in which that has happened over the last several years. When you think about who is a reputable source of information on any controversial topic, including this one, I think one of the key questions that you want to ask is, if a piece of evidence comes out that runs counter to what they typically say or what they believe, are they willing to change their mind? And I would say that when I've done some of this research that we're going to talk about today, a lot of the answers that we get aren't the ones that we've been expecting. And so that's why, as we continue to learn more about this, you have to be willing to sort of be open to ideas that aren't quite what you had originally expected. So it's been great to be in Wyoming for the last day. Chris has been a great host. I've learned a lot more about mining than I have in the last several years already in the day that I've been here. So you've got my contact information here. So feel free to think of me as a resource moving forward. So like I said, we're going to talk about the science, we're going to talk about the risks and the benefits, because there are both in this very polarizing topic, risks and benefits, and then the policies. What we have in the United States, obviously in Wyoming you really don't have these policies, and we'll talk about that, but what is available in the United States? Where are things heading? What are the problems with some of the policies that have been implemented? So in terms of disclosures, I've been primarily funded by the government, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, also some other foundations. You heard, I have a book out. It's in the library. That's great. And also on Amazon, things like that. So check that out. So what do I do? So here's another point where you have to think about who are you getting your information from? So I'm a clinician first and foremost. So I treat patients every day in a variety of settings. And again, in this topic, when you hear about marijuana, there are a lot of lobbyists, a lot of people who have skin in the game financially in terms of how you're going to vote. And so they're skewed in many ways. They have a financial stake in how some of these votes turn out. I just treat the patients, really. And I'll explain to you that as I've been treating patients over the years, I've been more and more interested in how the policies shake out, because I really believe that the core interest in policy should be to give people what they want. And so again, a lot of people want cannabis in a variety of ways in the United States. Give people what they want while limiting risk. I think there are ways to do that, and we'll talk about that in greater detail. So I'm an addiction psychiatrist, so I'm a psychiatrist who treats patients who have addictions, and I do that in a variety of settings. People can be in our hospital for another reason. They could be getting a heart valve replaced or have an infection, that sort of thing, and they also have an addiction problem. We'll go see them on the floors. I have a variety of clinics which help people with addictions, and then I have a private practice, and like I said, or as Chris mentioned, I work with athletes. So if you're an athlete or you like sports, you know that cannabis and sports they go hand in hand these days, and so the policies in those leagues are important, and we're helping to shape some of those policies. I do clinical research, so as we'll talk about today, there are a subset of users. So again, despite what sometimes you hear from people who are strongly opposed to cannabis, only a fraction of users develop the significant problems that we're going to talk about. And for that group of people, I'd like there to be effective treatments available. So we do clinical trials with medications that may ultimately prove to be helpful for those people, to help them stop using cannabis. And finally, this last bullet's what I'm doing here today. Trying to bridge the gap between what the science says and what public perception is. There's a large gap, as we'll talk about. We'll talk about why that is. So I work with high schoolers, elementary schoolers. As I was saying to Chris, I was in a Massachusetts community college last Thursday night, And so, this is an important way to really reach out. And I try to influence policy when I can. And my record there has been checkered, I would say, at best, because it's very difficult. Policymakers are very busy, and they have other interests. They have people they need to answer to. So the policies, as we'll see, that we have in the United States aren't always the best policies, unfortunately. I think they could be improved, and we'll talk about that. So how did I get involved with cannabis as a professional? Well, people who treat addiction problems like I do typically see 40% alcohol. So as much as we really don't hear about alcohol these days, it's as dangerous as ever. Many, many people still have problems with alcohol, drinking too much, medical problems resulting from that. Opioids, obviously, so there is an opioid epidemic in the United States these days, and it's every bit as bad as you may imagine or you may have heard. The fact of the matter is, one way that opioids differ from alcohol or even cannabis is that patients who are addicted to opioids die every day. They overdose. So this is really horrible in many ways, and so in a hospital setting, we're seeing a lot of patients with opioid problems. And then 20% everything else. And so as I started to work, as I finished my training, I was working in one of these programs and treating people with alcohol problems or opioid problems. When you sit down with these folks and you talk to them and you take a careful history, which takes time and effort, I found that more than half of them were talking about a time in their lives that they were using cannabis daily for years, usually in their late teens or early 20s. So that's a special group of people, right? They already have addiction problems, they're in a program, but of those people, a lot of them use cannabis for years. And so the wheels started turning at that point, and I began to wonder, what if we're able to identify treatments that work for that group? Would we see fewer people down the road with alcohol problems or opioid problems? And so for my small research team, that's really the primary goal and the belief that if we're able to do two things, if we're able to, number one, identify a treatment that actually work, and number two, let people know about it. So I think that's one area where folks in the medical fields like myself have come up woefully short. We don't take the time to let people know about the latest and greatest in terms of treatments. So physicians who do what I do, it's really hard even for doctors to keep up with the latest in literature. People don't really read as much as they could. They're pressed for time. And so a lot of great research is done around the country, and it's published in journals that people don't read. And so if the medical profession has a hard time keeping up, then how would anybody else know what they're supposed to be doing? So a lot of times when I'm giving talks, we're talking a lot about treatment. So that's not the focus of the talk today, but when you think about it, if somebody has a problem with alcohol or opioids and their family has never gone through this before, how would they know how to go about getting help? Who do you go to? What does it look like? That sort of thing. So I spent a lot of time doing that as well. So when we talk about cannabis, one of the main points I want to make today, again, I've kind of alluded to this earlier, that there's an incredibly polarizing topic. You got people who are dealing with this at the extremes, trying to sway you one way or another in hopes that you'll vote one way or another. But I believe that the answers with cannabis are really in the middle. And I think it's important to think about this from a clinical perspective as somebody who treats patients, and from a policy perspective. So think about this. I see a lot of young people, similar demographic as you guys, who have a problem with cannabis. They come in smoking every day, multiple times a day. They are on the verge of being suspended or been suspended. They have legal problems, whatever it is. They come to my office. Granted, they're not there on their own. They're getting pushed in by their family, by their school, by their employer, whatever it is. But if I were to sit with those folks and just take an inch worth of the scientific papers that we're going to talk about today, some of them, and just push it across the desk and say, look, what are you doing? Are you crazy? Why are you doing this? If I were to do that, I'm not going to get anywhere. They're not going to ever come back. So what I have to do is I have to understand there's at least a perceived benefit. There's a reason why they do this every day. They've been doing this every day for years. They feel that it helps in some way. By the time they get to me, it's quite likely that the risks outweigh those benefits, but I have to try to engage at that point, meet them where they are in that way if I'm going to get anywhere from a clinical perspective. From a policy perspective, we'll talk about this in greater detail, think about what has been done in the United States with cannabis policy so far. Like I said, you got these two sides. People that say that this is the greatest thing ever, it's harmless. I mean, you've heard those stories. The flip side, you got a lot of people who are well-meaning who go into groups like this and they relay the message, if you use cannabis, you're doomed. So, greatest thing ever, harmless, if you use, you're doomed. Neither of those is true. The answers are really in the middle. And so we have those two sides when it comes to policy, digging in their heels around the country on decriminalization, medical cannabis, legalization, and they roll the dice. Sometimes the pro-people win, sometimes the anti-people win, and you end up with policies that are not as good as they should be in such a great country. Right? We should be at the fore. We should have the best policy with cannabis compared to other countries. And we don't, unfortunately, and we really should. And part of that is because there's no compromise. There's zero compromise. If you look closely at what has been done in the other states, so 29 states in the District of Columbia have medical cannabis. We've got 9 states and the district, again, with legalized cannabis. The policies in those states are not as good as they could be. There's no exception there. And so it really is unfortunate in that way. So let's move to the data, okay, the science of this. What do the trends look like? And then we'll move into the risks of cannabis and the benefits, because there are both, obviously. So the scope of the issue. I think you know some of these trends, but it's good to have the numbers. Again, if I mention any papers here that you're interested in, you can't get on your own, let me know. I can try to help you out with that. Although we want to keep that quiet in terms of copyrights and things of that sort. But national statistics, this is not going away. As you know, the interest, I think, mirrors the increase in cannabis use over the last several years. So we've got over 22 million Americans using cannabis in the last year. That's a lot of people, obviously. It represents a doubling over the past 10 years. And you hear really powerful messages, right? You've heard about medical marijuana, how great it can be. Some people think it's a problem, obviously. Legalization, people have strong opinions. As much as I'm grateful for you guys filling the room here today, I know that if Justin Bieber says something about weed, he's going to reach a lot more people today than I ever could. So there is a tremendous tide of misinformation in many ways. Most of what you hear, like I said, isn't accurate. It comes from people who really don't know what the truth is. They don't really care what the truth is, frankly. They're just trying to get you to do what they do or do what they really want you to do. So that's a major issue. This slide's very important here. This slide shows the relative addictive potential of cannabis relative to other substances, and again, what we're trying to help you do, help you to learn how to frame this information. If you want to have a sensible conversation with somebody, if you were to talk with high school students, let's say, about the risks of this, if you want to have an evidence-based perspective, this is an important slide. So like I said earlier, most people who use cannabis don't develop addiction problems, but some people do. The people that I see are using multiple times a day, every single day, and they're having major problems in key areas of their lives. Work, school, relationships. I mean, people that I've treated have lost multi-million-dollar careers because they haven't been able to stop using something that they don't feel is addictive. So there's a lot at stake for some people. So it's about 9% of adults, 1 in 10 or so, and about 1 in 6 with kids. And the kids, there's much more at stake there. It's a higher risk. There's a higher percentage of users who develop addiction. As I like to say, if I have 6 15-year-old kids using cannabis, only one of them will go on to develop an addictive disorder, but I can't tell you which one it's going to be. So for that demographic, you really have to bring the cavalry if you're concerned. There's a lot at stake. Your brain develops into your mid-20s, so for people like me, it's over, but for you, there's still a lot of potential there. So how much you use, what you use in those early years really makes a big difference. Another point I want to make is that I actually like the comparison between cannabis and alcohol. Most people who use either one of those substances don't develop addiction. I think the major difference between the two is that as a society, we recognize that alcohol is dangerous. Everybody out there knows that alcohol is a problem, and yet you don't think that about cannabis. You're not aware of what the potential harms could be. And we need to do a better job. As adults, I'm fine with people making decisions about using whatever substance they want to, as as long as they're aware of the risk. I feel like we need to do a better job of educating people about the potential risk of a substance where we've got millions of people using, right? Another key point is that when you think about the relative addictive potential of cannabis compared to alcohol or opioids, cannabis is less addictive than those other substances. But, as I like to emphasize when we talk about this, just because cannabis may not be as addictive as other substances, just because it may not be as dangerous in terms of causing death today, so you can drink yourself to death today, you can certainly have an opioid overdose, and that's not going to happen with cannabis. But just because cannabis is not as dangerous as alcohol or opioids doesn't mean that it's not dangerous. It can be dangerous. If you use today, make a decision that you wouldn't otherwise make, if you're using significantly daily, multiple times a day, and you do that for a period of time, you're going to have a host of problems as we're going to talk about. So I think it's important to frame it that way. And it gets back to sort of how we do this. People who are worried about people using cannabis, young people using cannabis, they don't want to talk about that. They don't want to compare it because they feel like if they say that cannabis is not as dangerous or not as addictive as these other substances, then they're giving kids the green light. I disagree. I think you can have a sensible conversation with people about this. And if you ground everything in a sensible conversation in evidence, I think you make a lot more progress than what we've done so far. So to look at the trends, some of which we've talked about, again, the blue line, the green line, this is a paper that was published in a major journal last year, are on the rise. So recreational cannabis use is on the rise. This purple line here, I think, is very important. This is perception of no risk of harm. So as cannabis use is increasing around the country, around the world, the risks aren't really clear. People aren't aware of what those risks are. So yes, they're using alcohol, they're using opioids, they're aware that those substances are dangerous to a certain extent, and they're not quite aware of what the science is for cannabis. We need to do a better job there. So why is this so complicated? Why is this something that so many people are interested in? They don't quite know what the truth is. I think it's for a variety of reasons. I think the first one is that we've talked about, right? People are interested in making it simple, black or white. That's kind of the American way, good or bad, and it's not that way with cannabis. I think we have to be comfortable with shades of gray, right? Being in the middle, as I said earlier. People are misguided by their own experiences. So your parents, for example, if they may have used cannabis years ago, as we'll talk about, they're using a different substance than is available right now in terms of the potency. So that's one thing. I hear really two stories. Number one, look, we knew that our daughter was using with her friends, but we did that too. We turned out okay. Or, look, we knew that our son was in his room by himself smoking at night, but we hear so much about the opioid epidemic, we're grateful that he's not doing that. So I understand those points of view, but it really doesn't fully comprehend the context here that we're talking about a substance that is much more dangerous than it was before, as we'll see. So that's important. But you begin to appreciate why this is so cloudy in so many ways. Finally, math can be tricky. I don't like to deal with large numbers if I don't have to. And with cannabis, we got large numbers. So again, we got this many people using. Even if only a fraction of those users develop addiction, a small fraction of a large number can be a very large number, and that's the case here. In the country, we've got millions of people who are using daily, multiple times a day, wake and bake, first thing in the morning, go to work. They're having all kinds of problems. And as you can imagine, it's hard for them to seek the help that they may need if they keep hearing, hey, this is a harmless substance. Everybody else says this is no big deal, right? So those are the people that I see. Key myths here, just to reinforce what the science is. Myths, not harmful, not addictive, no withdrawal. But I will say this, in terms of the harms, one thing that the anti-marijuana people don't talk about enough is that the dose really matters, right? So the harms that we're talking about here, cognitive problems, worsening anxiety, worsening depression, increased risk of psychosis. We'll talk about these in greater detail in just a second. But these problems really are directly related to the dose, how much you're using over what period of time. And so again, when we talk about these kind of problems, we're talking about people who are using a lot of marijuana. They're using every day pretty much. So a lot of people use, and they don't use in that way. They use once a week, once a month. And so in that way, we're not really getting the full picture. The problems that we hear about often are really not applicable to, or we don't have the evidence for sporadic use. Right? We do know that heavy use causes these problems. So let's talk about it. If you're using regularly at an early age in a significant way, your brain is affected, you recruit different parts of your brain to get the same amount of work done. There's a famous study came out in 2012 that showed following people over time that if you start using at 13, 14, 15 in a heavy manner, then you will have up to an 8-point decline in your IQ. So that's significant. If you lose it, you can't get it back. Worsening anxiety, which is important because it's one of the reasons people say they use cannabis. I hear this every single day. And again, what's not intuitive about this, what makes it hard is that if you're anxious, you use cannabis, your anxiety is going to go down. But when the effect of the marijuana wears off, your anxiety seesaws back up. So overall, using marijuana to treat anxiety, not a good idea. It worsens depression, as you can imagine, if you're not fulfilling your responsibilities. You know, if you choose to get high this afternoon, you're not doing your homework, eventually you got to answer to that. It's probably not going to be good. And at this point, which I think is very important, if you have a family history of a psychotic disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, those are typical psychotic disorders. If you have a family history of one of those problems and you're using cannabis regularly at an early age, you are much more likely to express one of those disorders, probably around 5 times more likely depending on which study you look at. So let's be clear, I'm not saying that using marijuana causes these disorders, but it increases the likelihood that you will run into problems if you have a family history of this. So there is a lot at stake here when you're deciding about what you're going to do. Are you going to, just like if you're going to drink, right? You know there's certain risks there, but we're aware of what those risks are. We need to be aware of what the risks with cannabis are. So here's one of the other key myths. People will say this all the time. It's not addictive, or it's not physically addictive. I say, however you want to define addiction. So I like a simple definition, repeated use despite harm, or if you want to get into the diagnostic and statistical manuals that psychiatrists use, needing more and more to get the same effect. If you do stop, do you have withdrawal, that sort of thing. It meets the definition. So we've got the brain on the left here. The nucleus accumbens is the pleasure center of the brain. Many drugs of abuse or processes that are reinforcing cause release of certain neurotransmitters in your brain. Dopamine is probably one that you may have heard of before. So on the right side, we have the dopaminergic surge, or the release of dopamine when you use certain substances. So amphetamine stimulants on the top, got marijuana here, I don't know, cheesecake maybe? I don't know, whatever your vice is. But the point is, and importantly, the scales are different, but the process is the same. If you are using substances that are pleasurable, if you're doing things, shopping, gambling, that are pleasurable, you have a dopaminergic surge in your brain, a release of dopamine. And so I want to make that point. I don't like I said earlier, I like the comparison between alcohol and marijuana, but I don't like deciding between soft drugs and hard drugs. Because again, everyone I think here would agree, if you're going to do that, cocaine is a hard drug, but marijuana is doing roughly the same thing. So I don't like that distinction. I will offer another important point, is that people make choices about what their drug of choice is, right? So that can be a hard drug, a soft drug, whatever. And you know this too from your experience. Some people don't like marijuana. They don't like it. It doesn't make me feel good. Tried it, didn't have a good experience with it, don't like it. Other people say, hey, that's my thing, and they start using. Sometimes they may go too far, right? And that happens really with every substance. You make decisions about what you like. So for the people that really like cannabis, they can use it as much as other people would use alcohol or opioids. And so by the time somebody gets to me in my office sitting with me, they've got some kind of problem. Something put them on the radar, somebody's worried about them. And at that point, it is often hard to tell who's got a problem with alcohol or marijuana or opioids, frankly. And again, I'm not going to downplay opioids. I mean, that's the extreme. People are overdosing. You could get revived. You could die, that sort of thing. So that's very significant. But the point is, people take marijuana use to a very significant extreme, which is a major problem for many people. And then finally, this piece you're probably not familiar with, this idea that you will have a physical withdrawal from cannabis if you're using a lot every single day and you stop abruptly. So you will have anxiety, irritability, difficulty sleeping. This is a series of studies done from a couple of top researchers at Hopkins and Dartmouth who showed very nicely that the cannabis withdrawal syndrome that is recognized among doctors is very similar to nicotine withdrawal, which we're probably more familiar with. You know, if you're smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, 20 cigarettes a day, and you stop, it's tough. You feel jittery, you feel lousy, anxious, that sort of thing. Similar things will happen if you're using a lot of marijuana. And from my perspective, I just need to educate, I need to do two things. Educate people about it, so if they're going to try to stop, they're going to be prepared, because having withdrawal symptoms are often what get people to continue to use. And then the other piece is, obviously, it would be great if we had a treatment for these folks if they were trying to stop and they needed some help. Let's talk about the pharmacology of cannabis. So cannabis plant, you got hundreds of compounds of chemicals in there. Cannabinoids are distinct to the cannabis plant. And so we have probably, I would say, 106 cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. We probably only talk about 2 in the United States. So delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. It, as you know, makes you high. It also has some anti-inflammatory properties, and then on the flip side, it can make you psychotic. So you all know people who tried cannabis and didn't have a good experience, you know, made them paranoid, right? You've heard that before, so that can happen. CBD, cannabidiol, is sort of the hot cannabinoid in the last few years, and so it's something that I've studied in our clinical trials. It's not psychoactive, so it won't make you high. It has anti-anxiety and probably antipsychotic properties, so very, very promising. When you hear about these 2 cannabinoids, you hear about them together, and one of the reasons you hear about them together is because they actually are competing with each other for precursors at the plant level. I know we have a plant expert coming in at 1:30. Maybe we could talk more about that. But simplistically, they're competing, and that is why when you hear people adjusting the ratio of THC, increase THC, reduce CBD, it's because they're competitive in that way. But one important point I would offer is that, again, we got 106 cannabinoids, and we only talk about 2. So there's a lot of room for improvement. There's a lot more that we need to know in that area. Potency, so I mentioned this earlier. So if anybody out there used years ago, 60s, 70s, and 80s, THC content 3 or 4%. So now the latest published data, one of my colleagues who's in Mississippi published in 2016, average THC content about 12, 13%. But if we try to go by the plant, we could pretty easily get THC in the 20s or 30s. So think about that. People, your parents perhaps, using something that's very, very different than what is available now. What does that mean? If there were problems then, are you more likely to have those problems now? Questions like that are questions that we need to know more about as we move forward, as millions of people are using this substance. And then briefly we'll mention other forms. These are talks, their own talks really. So synthetic marijuana, K2 spice are common names there. Who uses these substances? People who are going to be drug tested. So if you're on probation, if you're an athlete, if you live in a group home, if you're in the military, you're going to perhaps use one of these substances because it's not going to show up on a typical drug screen. But the synthetic cannabis is actually more dangerous than the plant itself. I mentioned a couple of slides ago that cannabidiol, the CBD, works against the THC in some ways. It buffers the harsh effects of it in some ways. We can simplify it a bit. You don't have that type of buffer with synthetic weed, right? You have what we call an unopposed agonist that's similar to THC. So on the whole, I would say synthetic marijuana is worse than the plant itself. Bottom left here, we got concentrates, wax, shatter. People talk about dabbing. This is what they're talking about. They're talking about, for the chemistry majors in here, you're distilling the plant product down to a very pure form, 80 to 90% THC. I think you know what that means, right? So can give you a powerful high, but it also can cause some problems. If you were going to perhaps be paranoid on 20% THC plant, well, now you got 80% concentrate. All right, we might have an issue. So as you can imagine, I've seen a lot of those folks. E-cigarettes, nicotine's not the only thing in an e-cigarette. You can buy liquid THC, you can put your own stuff in there just to be aware. And we've heard a lot about edibles. For me, this to me underscores the problems in education that we've had. We've had a lot of problems with edibles, increased visits to the ER, for example, in states like Colorado, because we do a horrible job of educating people about this stuff. It's really not that complicated. So let's talk about two things. The packaging. Should it be packaged that way? No. Okay, so it's appealing to toddlers, it's shiny, or a little bit older kids, hey, I like Kit Kats, so that's an issue, right? So that should be relatively simple. And Colorado and other states have moved away from this type of packaging. The other part, for the rest of us, is the idea that there's different kinetics when you eat a substance versus inhaling a substance. The onset of action. So what happens over and over and over again, you may have known people or had experiences like this. If you want an edible, I'm going to try an edible. I'm in Colorado, I'm going to try this. Take a bite, nothing happens. Take another bite, nothing happens. So a half hour later, when it hits you, you've got 3-4 times the dose. And that's how people end up in the ER. The other piece is, the dosing of these products. I mean, you got a brownie that's got 200 milligrams of THC in it, let's say, and you're supposed to take a bite of it. Like I eat the whole brownie, right? If I'm eating, right? So that's kind of counterintuitive. Those things could be largely avoided with better education. And that pains me to see us still having these kind of problems. I mean, people are going through visits to the emergency room where it really doesn't need to happen. So let's shift away from the risks and talk about the policies and then some of the benefits as well. One key point that I want to make about this in the United States, there's a difference between ideas and implementation. So we can have a great debate, maybe we'll do that in the panel or in the Q&A period, about the relative merits of these policies. Are they good? Are they bad? Should we have the ability to do this? Should adults be able to do what they want to do? Those are great points for discussion. What really is very clear and is less of an argument is that the way that these policies have been implemented in the United States leaves a lot to be desired. That's being kind. Okay? So there's a difference between ideas and implementation. We can have good ideas and really do a lousy job of implementing them. And that's in many ways what we've done in this country so far. So looking through the lens of Massachusetts, which is a blue state where we've had all these things occur, to try to get a sense for these policies and what could go wrong, that type of thing. So in 2008, we decriminalized possession of less than 1 ounce of cannabis in Massachusetts. So if you get caught with half an ounce, it's a civil infraction. You get a ticket, you get fined, whatever. It's not a big deal, really. So possession of small amounts of cannabis for personal use, that's what decriminalization is all about. I don't have a problem with that at all. So I have family members, I have an older brother who's a police officer, I have a younger brother who's a DA. We talk about these type of things. I don't think this is a great leap, right? You can do what you want to do if you're an adult, leave them alone. But the problem is with me and this law is the way it's written, less than 1 ounce. So again, one of the themes here, things about cannabis that are not intuitive. To me, ounces of things are small amounts generally. A drink, right? We've got 12, 16 ounces here, right? So an ounce to me is small, but an ounce of a dried plant product is a lot. Yeah. Anybody, so we got an ounce here. Anybody know how many grams in an ounce? 28, wow. So that's right, 28, I think it's 28.6. The only reason I know that is I've shown this slide a few hundred times probably, but so hats off to you. But the point is, and we saw the slide earlier, there's a lot of different ways people use marijuana, but everybody knows joints. So a joint, according to the World Health Organization, is typically 0.5 gram to a gram. Okay, and we just heard 28 grams or so in an ounce. So when we look at an ounce of weed, And we got 50 plus joints. So we take it the next step and think about this law, and I ask you, right? If you catch me walking around with 3/4 of an ounce of marijuana, is that personal use? I say, for the most part, no. And so here's a relatively simple way, if the limit was lower, it was at half an ounce, quarter ounce, whatever. If the limit's lower, I think you better meet the spirit of this law than 1 ounce. And then another secret, and I'm not saying anything that is, I think, incorrect, but policymakers are really busy people. And a lot of times when they're tasked with making these kind of policies, they look at what other people have done, what my neighbor do, what these other states do. And so what happens is when you look at decrim laws around the country in cities or states, 90+% are 1 ounce and below. And I just think that's a poor choice when you think about it. Medical marijuana, 2012 in Massachusetts. I mentioned earlier, we're kind of a liberal place, and so it was overwhelmingly voted in. And so let's talk about that, medical marijuana. So this guy here is doing what some people do, particularly in the healthcare professions, when they see medical wine, medical marijuana, what's up with that? So they do a double take in many ways. So as you can imagine, a lot of physicians who I work with are very hesitant to get involved. They're skeptical in many ways. I talk with these people every day, every single day about these issues. So what is the state of the science with medical marijuana? So I've written stuff about this. If you want to read more, the book's a good place. Obviously, these are a little bit tougher to read in journals and stuff, but I've written a lot about medical marijuana. And the reality is that there are benefits to medical marijuana, but it's a limited amount of benefit at this point. And we'll talk about what disorders we can point to for benefits with cannabis. So what is available now? It's important when you think about this and you think about what patients want, why they're interested in this. It's because, and we saw earlier, 106 cannabinoids. We talk about 2, and we've got 2 cannabinoid products available from the FDA. So dronabinol, marinol, pure THC, nabalone's an agonist, produces a lot of effects similar to marijuana. They're FDA approved for 2 things: nausea and vomiting associated with cancer chemotherapy, and then appetite stimulation. So again, when I first encountered people who wanted medical marijuana, I would say, in kind of a knee-jerk reaction, hey, have you tried dronabinol? Maybe you should try dronabinol. But the more I read about this, the more I talked to people, the more I learned about it and did our own research. Like I said, we've been studying this for a while. I began to realize, wait a minute, we got 2 medicines here. We got 100 plus cannabinoids, maybe cannabidiol, or the other cannabinoids or combinations. So that's the entourage effect. Combinations of cannabinoids, maybe those can do better than what we have available as a physician. And I would say that if you're open-minded, you've got to be open to the possibility that cannabidiol or other cannabinoids are going to be better than the limited number that we've got. It seems pretty logical, right? So I think you have to be open to that possibility. So when people are asking for this, they understand, you know what, there's a lot of potential here in this compound, in this plant, and we don't have very much available right now through the FDA. What do the laws say? And so I'm setting you up here. There's a juxtaposition between what the laws say and what the science says. According to the laws in states, we talked about it, 29 states in the district, mostly talk about really big, significant illnesses, cancer, etc. That's what people vote for. Look, we don't want to keep medical marijuana out of the hands of somebody who's dying with cancer, and I get that. A lot of the states have the same conditions stipulated. Overall, when you look at, again, almost 30 states now, you got about 53 different conditions, so a lot of conditions. Unfortunately, a lot of people who have medical marijuana cards, they don't have any of these conditions. So we start to see the difference between ideas and implementation when we talk about this. What does the science say? So we need more research, clearly. We'll talk about that. There are significant barriers to the kind of research that I do and what other people are doing around the country. But there is a fair amount of research already, and we need to build upon that. According to me and some other people, and we'll look at the other people too, the best evidence for medical marijuana is really for 3 things: chronic pain, neuropathic pain, so that's a kind of a burning sensation that you get in your nerves with certain conditions, and then spasticity associated with multiple sclerosis. So not to get too technical, but when I say good evidence, I'm talking about multiple positive randomized controlled trials, because that's what you need to ultimately get an FDA indication. So for these things, we're probably going to have other cannabinoids approved within the next few years. So that's good. But we do need to recognize that until that takes place with just 2 cannabinoids available, maybe there is a place for medical marijuana when somebody has one of these conditions, or potentially other conditions too. But this is where the best evidence is. Cannabis and pain, people talk about this all the time. Again, if you're into it, you want to read more to talk about why cannabis, the scientific basis for that. We published a paper a couple of months ago in one of the journals. That's open access, so that's free. Check that out. And this was a major report, came out earlier this year by the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Math, or in Medicine, excuse me. And they found essentially what I did a couple of years ago, that there's conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis or cannabinoids are effective for chronic pain, and then chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. Like I said, we've already got an FDA indication for that. There's a third paper that said moderate quality for chronic pain and spasticity. So for papers being published in major journals, they are starting to identify medical conditions for which this is useful. We don't know about a lot of other conditions. And so then the question becomes, well, should we have many, many people using marijuana for things that there isn't a lot of evidence? Sometimes, they may have tried first-line treatment, second-line treatment. It may make sense. But you got to be open to that. What do we got in the state of Wyoming? Not much. Not much. So no decriminalization. You've got a CBD-only, CBD oil statute in place. So I guess a physician, if they want to recommend somebody use cannabidiol for a medical condition, you can do that. There have been some people raising the question of legalization. It hasn't gotten very far, apparently. So there's not much going on out here in terms of marijuana. And I'm sure we'll talk about why that is. So the final frontier is legalization. So let's talk about that. Because to me, this is really the best, most complex place. Medical, I don't think is that complicated. Where is the evidence? If there's evidence, then let's do it. But this is much more complex. And so this was an op-ed I wrote. In Massachusetts, we voted on legalization in November 2016. And we voted yes, of course, for it. So what are the pros and cons of legalization? So again, you can make really good arguments on either side here. The pros, personal freedom. Americans, adults should be able to do whatever they want. I mean, that's a pretty good argument, I think. People feel like if you legalize this, you bring it out of the darkness, you decrease the black market. So one point I just want to make for the, to counter what the really staunch pro-marijuana folks will say, you're never going to eliminate the black market. There's always going to be somebody selling something different, something cheaper, but you will greatly decrease the black market if you legalize cannabis. You're going to make some tax money out of this. It's not going to solve every problem, but you're going to make some money. Colorado, in the first year, I think they made 75 million or so, and those numbers are only going up. And then reduction of racial disparities that we're going to talk about in a second. So those are legit. Those are good arguments. On the other side, you've got good arguments as well. Will this mean more kids use marijuana? That's probably the biggest argument that anti-marijuana people use, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Commercialization, so what happens when the tobacco companies or Anheuser-Busch, what happens when they get involved? Is that going to be good? It was one of another person who does, the anti-marijuana folks talks about big tobacco 2.0. Driving under the influence, which to me is probably the biggest con in terms of the evidence, because it's very clear, as we'll see in a minute. Just don't have the technology. So you can't really hold people accountable. Will this mean more addiction? We're actually, some data starting to suggest that we are seeing increased rates of cannabis use disorder. But what does the data show? Because again, people are going to twist all this evidence however they want. So the youth access is a great example. Like I said earlier, people who mean well are on both sides are guilty of distorting the evidence. So according to the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Authority, which is a very anti-marijuana group, they said that in Colorado, So try to follow me here. This is kind of confusing. Youth past month use increased 20% in a 2-year average following legalization of recreational cannabis in Colorado compared to 2-year average prior to legalization. That's a quote. That sounds bad, doesn't it? But it's not statistically significant. So to me, it's misleading, unfortunately. So again, I understand, and I don't want more kids using marijuana either. But this is misleading. If you say this happened and this is supposed to be evidence of the sky falling in Colorado, it's not statistically significant. According to the government in Colorado, they prefer Healthy Kids Colorado survey, which shows relatively unchanged. So in Colorado, the evidence is really not clear at this point. So you really can't make a strong case either way. And sometimes you just have to be able to sit with that. But people don't want to do that. Earlier, last year actually, the first evidence came out showing some actual increase in youth access. This is a paper published in a major journal, and what they showed, they looked at multiple states, and they showed in Washington state, in 8th grade and 10th grade, but not 12th, there was an increase in youth use. So that's important because it says in some of these states you may see an increase in youth access. But I want to be clear, when you look at all this evidence, you just don't have enough evidence overall to really know definitively. And that's why one of the things that I push for, state after state after state, is setting up the infrastructure to study these types of questions. As more states do this, let's start studying this now. Right? We got some labs out there, Colorado, Washington, Alaska, Oregon, but other states are going to do this. Let's be ready to study this in a meaningful way. Let's have national registries to look at some of these issues. Driving. So simply put, when you think about this, right? When you're drunk, you run red lights. When you're stoned, you stop at green lights. So there is impairment there. There's impairment, but it's a little bit different how it works. So with alcohol, obviously, you drink, you're not checking your mirrors, you're making what we call errors of omission. You're careless. You're laying on the gas, you're not paying attention in the way that you normally would. I know you guys, some people have class, feel free to leave. We're wrapping up anyway. With cannabis, it's different. You know that you're impaired. You're taking more care. You're being very, very cautious. But if you're driving, 25 in a 55, that's not safe as well. So those are what we call errors of commission, being too careful. So both are a problem. And importantly, the amount that experience that you have using cannabis also, just like alcohol, affects your ability. So you can have a more experienced user who's going to be less affected. To me, the major issue is, though, that we don't have the technology in the way that we have technology for alcohol impairment. So there's not a 0.08 blood alcohol content equivalent at this point. There's no breathalyzer for marijuana. And so what they do in Colorado, they do the best that they can. They test, they draw blood in the field, they use a 5 nanograms per milliliter limit. And I think that if you told me there's no breathalyzer available, let's design a program, this is a pretty good program. But the problem is that if you draw blood and somebody is above the limit, let's say today is Friday, they may have used a lot early Thursday, that sort of thing. So you can be above that 5 nanogram per ml limit and really not be impaired. So it's not a good proxy for impairment, not as good as blood alcohol content. It's a good attempt at this given the technology that we have, but it's not great. So when you think about this, what has happened, there have been problems, right? So again, there's dueling statistics in many ways, increase in motor vehicle accidents, although just because you have a positive THC urine or a blood test at a crash site doesn't mean that necessarily contributed, obviously. AAA, multiple claim that marijuana-related crashes doubled. But then to the counter, there's some data that says in the medical marijuana states fewer traffic fatalities. So again, the data really isn't to the level that we really need, but we do know that the technology is not what we want. And then finally, let's talk about racial disparities. Everybody uses marijuana, so there's not one particular group, but African Americans and other minorities are singled out in many ways. Looking at certain data points, in District of Columbia, 8 times more likely to be arrested according to the ACLU. In Massachusetts, put the number slightly lower, but the point of the matter is that they unfairly bear the brunt of this problem when everybody's using. So will legalization solve that problem? We really don't know at this point. The last points that I want to make, and then we'll take some questions. In terms of opioids and cannabis, there is a strong early body of evidence suggesting that opioids are a little less necessary. If you're using opioids for chronic pain treatment and people are using cannabis, you may need fewer opioids. So that's strong. But I do want to say there's a difference between using medical marijuana to decrease the need for opioid medications versus using it to treat opioid use disorder or heroin addiction. So there's no evidence there at this point. 3 studies that do show this relationship. So an important study in JAMA Internal Medicine, 2014, medical marijuana states fewer opioid overdoses, and then these were borne out in a couple of other studies. The point is that there is a connection and there is some evidence there, and so we need to study that further. The ability to have medical marijuana may be a positive thing in this opioid epidemic in some ways. But unfortunately, the research really has not kept pace with the interest. And many reasons for that. It's kind of a topic of its own. Polarizing nature of the topic. Some people don't want the answers, right? I'm making money. In my state, let's say, the policy is how I like this. I don't want to change. Some people feel that way. And then if you're going to try to do the research, there are many barriers here. So overall, policy is ahead of the science. It bothers me a lot. I feel like we should really have science-based, evidence-based policies in a great nation like this. And in many ways, we don't. Clearly, the policy is ahead of the science. It needs to catch up, but there are things that need to change for us to do that. Critical period. As use is increasing, we know that that's true. Research and education have to increase. I think there's a possibility to do this in a better way, in a sensible, evidence-based way, not a fear-based way, to educate people about marijuana. And there still is an opportunity to do better policy in many places. So in states like this, you may be considering these policies in future years. That's an opportunity to try to do this in an evidence-based fashion, looking at what's been done in other places and doing what they've done well, doing it here, and avoiding things that they haven't done so well. Just like to thank a few people who contribute. Alan Wartenberg is a mentor of mine. Matt Palastro was one of my research assistants. Norfolk County DA's office, I work with them. And we'll take some questions. Thanks.